to human events to change them and affect his will. God has that power. But if God has that power to change anything, why is there ever injustice? Why doesn't everything work out in some right and fair way? That's the question that we're going to explore tonight. We've been studying in Esther, a series called God Unseen. The title is taken from the fact that Esther is one of the unique books in the Bible that never says the name of God. He is unseen in the book. Yet still, his hand is powerfully seen as he maneuvers events to manufacture Israel's salvation. But it's really good for us, because as we live our lives, we largely live God unseen. We don't know exactly what God is doing on a day-to-day basis. So it's good to know for us, by God's providence, that he can be powerful even when it's not obvious what God is doing, or even we feel that things should be different. Today, we're going to see the relationship between God's providence and an unjust world. What I hope to show you tonight is two examples in the text of injustice. And what I want to posit to you tonight is that God not only allows them, but even directs them. And he does so ultimately for good. But I want to ask the question at the end, why? Why would God allow or direct either of these two instances of injustice? To catch us up, Esther is the story of a young woman named Hadassah, who was taken from her cousin's house, who was in her care, and brought to be the queen of Persia, having won what is essentially the most glorified beauty contest that there ever was. So there in chapter 2, we're introduced to two people. First is her cousin, Mordecai. Mordecai is the one, not only is her cousin, but also is the one who raised her. And as such, as she is in the palace, he comes constantly to the gate to check on her well-being and to be present. But then we're introduced to his cousin. People always talk about Esther like it's his niece, but it's not. It's his cousin. And she has now become queen of Persia. And both Mordecai's proximity to her and her presence to the king is going to be important to our story for the day. Let me just tell you, as we start out today, Samantha has taken up over the last few weeks, looking at me saying, "So, what you thinking about? Are you thinking about another woman?" "Yes, and she's really pretty." That's been code for, "Yes, I'm totally studying Esther right now." And I imagine that's going to be the case for at least a few more weeks. She's bound to ask me at any point, "So what are you thinking about?" And usually if I'm deep in thought, I'm trying to work through something. And at least it's not, I'm tossing and turning in bed, and she looks at me and says, "So what are you thinking about?" "Leviticus." At least now I guess it's Esther. So here in Esther chapter 2, we're going to start in verse 19. Start in verse 19. It says, "And now when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai, just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai. And he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told it to the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles of the presence of the king." I want to talk to you first in this section about Mordecai's position. So Mordecai, regularly over the course of this book, is found at the king's gates, or even within the courtyard. You see that in chapter 2 in verse 10. Sorry. You see it in verse 12. It says, "Now when the turn came for each of the young women to go into King Ahasuerus after being the 12 months in the regulations for women." Man, my notes are all off right now. Hold on. chapter 11, verse 11. It says, "And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her." Then in verse 19, it says, "Now when the virgins were gathered together a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate." And then in verse 21, "And in those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate." Then you see it again in chapter 3, verse 2. It says, "And all the servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage." In all four of these verses, Mordecai is there at the king's gate. So I want to ask you, why is he there? I want to give you two possible explanations as to why he's there. The first is that Mordecai loiters. He just hangs around, but he does so to care for his cousin. You see that in verse 11, where it says, "And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her." So part of his proximity there, or at least his benefit of his proximity there, is that he's constantly asking about his cousin. And that might be the entire reason that he is there. But the second possibility as to why Mordecai is there is because Mordecai actually has an official position in the palace. That case is made stronger in chapter 3, verse 2. Look at this closely with me. It says, "And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage." So the king had given a command, and the command, according to this text, is that all of the king's servants are supposed to bow down and pay homage to Haman. And Mordecai is found in violation of that law. The only way that would make any sense is if he actually was one of the king's servants, that he had some official position, and that's why he's there constantly in the king's court. Karen Jobes, in her commentary on Esther, actually argues for this, not based on this verse alone, but on other uses in ancient Persia about being in the king's gate. So it's possible that Mordecai is there and he's got his own business to do. But his proximity is really important given the verse 21. It says, "In those days Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus." So just by happenstance, Mordecai finds out that two of the guards hope to assassinate the king. We're not told why. It just says that they became angry. And so all of a sudden, Mordecai has to do something. In verse 22, it says, you kind of see the progression of communication here. So first, it says that this came to the knowledge of Mordecai. Then Mordecai, it says, and he told Queen Esther. That means that Mordecai still has at least semi-regular conversations with Esther, or at least that he can have those conversations if the circumstances demand it. And then it says that Queen Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. So that's the progression here. Mordecai tells Esther, Esther tells the king, but she does so in the name of Mordecai, so that Mordecai is ultimately going to get the credit for uncovering this plot. It says in verse 23, "When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were hanged on the gallows." Now, when you read that, let me just ask you, is this what you have in mind? Do you have a noose in mind that they'd be hanged on the gallows? There was, he has his doctorate in some kind of ancient studies. His name is Dr. Abraham J. Berkowitz, and he was writing for thetor.com, and he wanted to explore what this verse means. And there's a reason why. It's because not only is this the fate of the two guards, by chapter 5, it is going to be the possible fate of Mordecai himself. So it says in chapter 5, verse 14, "Then his wife Zeresh and his friend said to him, 'Let gallows 50 feet or 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. So it's possible that Mordecai is going to die by this. And then in chapter 7, we're told that Haman will actually eventually die by this process. It says, then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, however, moreover, the gallows that Haman prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house 50 cubits high. And the king said, hang him on that. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated. So this process of hanging on the gallows actually becomes kind of important in the whole plot. Yeah, I know I just got ahead on the plot. So spoiler alert, the bad guy does not win in the end. Sorry if that was news to you. But so he's wanting to explore this to say, okay, what exactly does that mean? And what he discovered is that it was far more likely that this means impaled. And these are two reliefs. The first on the left is the relief of an attack of an enemy during the reign of Tiglath-Pileser, and the palace wall in Kalhu is what it says. And so you see kind of poles sticking up and 3 people laid across it as their chests are kind of hunched over. They've been impaled. The second is actually Judeans impaled by Sennacherib's army, a Lachish relief. And you see once again 3 spikes and 3 people being impaled upon them. Yes, I showed you the nice carved reliefs because that's a little bit more graphic than actually seeing someone impaled over a spike. But that actually also helps explain then at the end of the story. So not only does Haman fall to this fate, but also that Haman's sons are killed. And then later this happens. And that would make a whole lot more sense post-mortem for them to be impaled rather than hung by a noose, of which the goal is to break the neck and suffocate. Happy thoughts, right? All right, let's go ahead and move on. So at this point in the story, there's no injustice here, right? Because 2 guys who had planned to kill the king are discovered and then they're executed. Not a whole lot of injustice there. The injustice actually comes in chapter 3, verse 1. Look with me. It says, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all of the officials who were with him. So the reason why we should see this as an injustice is because this immediately follows Mordecai's act of faithfulness, which if you look later on in the story as the king kind of has a late night in chapter 6, is that the king sees that there's been a void, that Mordecai should have been honored. He should have been promoted or something, but nothing has happened for him yet. And instead of honoring Mordecai, who ascends but Haman, who is, this is our first introduction to him, but over the course of the story, what we're going to see is that he's a proud and arrogant man. He's defiant to God, and actually he will plan, like Hitler, to kill all of the Jews by the end of our chapter for today. So, if all things were to be just in the world, that is, all things were to work out according to who was good and who followed God, who would get the promotion in this story? Well, it's not Haman. It would be Mordecai. And that brings in all kinds of questions about God, even in particular. Why does God allow the wicked to prosper? And why does the righteous not always succeed? Those questions of injustice are brought into this passage. But there's a second injustice in this. So justice would elevate the one who saved the king, not the proud man defiant to God. But there's a second injustice, and that's in chapter 3, verses 1 through 15. Read the story with me. It says, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, why do you transgress the king's command? And when they spoke to him day after day, he would not listen to them. They told Haman, in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand. For he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast pur, that is, they cast lots, before Haman day after day. And they cast it month after month, till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples of all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries. So the king took his signet ring from the hand and gave it to Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, the money is given to you. The people also do with them as it seems good to you. Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and an edict, according to all that Haman commanded, was written to the king's satraps and to the governors over all the provinces, and to the official of all the people, to every province in his own script, and every people in its own language. And it was written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by courier to all the king's provinces with the instruction to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all the peoples to be ready for that day. The couriers went out hurriedly in order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa the citadel. And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. So here's our second story, and here's our second picture of injustice as well. Let me start by talking about Haman. So Haman, it says, was advanced. It says his throne was set higher than the other officials, and the king gives an edict that all the servants should bow down and pay homage to him. But Mordecai wouldn't do it. Mordecai refused to bow down, and we are not told why Mordecai refused to bow down. In fact, every possible reason given as to why Mordecai didn't is simply conjecture. But for some reason, he refused to do so. So Mordecai, at this point, this happens day after day, day after day, day after day. He won't listen. He won't bow down. He will not acknowledge Haman. And this to Haman is a personal assault, a personal insult. But he understands that the ramifications of this are more than just personal. So it says in verse 6, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. So Mordecai, from this point on in the story, is going to represent all the Jews. He's going to represent all the Jews as a target of Haman. He will also represent all the Jews in triumph by the end of the book. But for the edict, the fact that Mordecai is going to represent all Jews, this isn't even the first time in the story that this has happened. In fact, there was someone who was offended in the course of the book, and on account of that offense, there was an edict written sent out to the whole country. Do you remember that scene? It was Vashti. Vashti refused to obey the voice of the king and come into the banquet. And because of that, there was a proclamation written concerning all women in the the story. So you kind of get multiple times in the story that the event is getting extrapolated, expanded, blown way out of proportion. And that one person can even represent a whole group. So Mordecai is now going to represent all the Jews throughout the story. But there's an important part of this plot that comes in verse 7. It says, in the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of the king Ahasuerus, they cast pur. That is, they cast lots. I want to talk about this for just a second. So this would not have been too dissimilar to people throwing dice. Now, when people throw dice today, we think of it as simply a matter of mathematics, probability. That's why Vegas always wins, because the probability of whatever winning in the game is so bad, right? But that's not why they cast lots. It wasn't simply a matter of probability. People in ancient times cast lots in order to devise the will of the gods. And it even appears in the Bible. Let me give you a few examples of that. So the first one is found in Leviticus chapter 16 and verse 8. This is on the Day of Atonement, in which two twin goats are given as a possibility for the offering. And to discern between the two, which one is going to be sacrificed, they cast lots, in order to try to get God's indication as to which one is going to be sacrificed. God's will was discerned by casting lots. Then in Joshua chapter 18, verses 1 through 10, there are 7 tribes that have not yet received their portion of the land. And so they divide up the land into 7 portions and decide who gets what. They cast lots to discern God's will as to who is supposed to get which lot. I'm going to leave a space for Esther here, but I'm going to skip to Jonah chapter 1, verse 7. Jonah chapter 1, verse 7. Bob just got to teach Jonah who was casting lots in Jonah chapter 1, verse 17.
So who thought it was?
Exactly. So there's a huge storm, and the mariners on the boat, the pagan mariners, I will add, are casting lots, trying to figure out whose fault this is. On whose account, who made the God mad that there's this great storm now? And the lot, at that point, falls to Jonah. I'm going to point out, for that story in particular, that these are pagan mariners casting lots, and yet it's God's will, God's insight that is given in the story. I'll give you one more. In Acts chapter 1, verses 23 to 26, this is when the apostles are trying to figure out who is going to replace Judas. And in so doing, there are 2 men who are essentially equal. Matthias was eventually chosen, but in order to decide which of these 2 who are equally qualified, it said that they cast lots, trying to discern God's will concerning which of these 2 was going to replace Judas. Over and over again in the story, no matter if it's an Israelite casting lots or even a pagan casting lots, God's will is being discerned. So what about here in Esther chapter 3, verse 7? Here, they start casting lots. I don't know what exactly they're looking for, but it takes them a while. It says that they cast lots day after day, month after month, beginning in the first month and going all the way to the 12th. They spend 11 months, maybe even a whole year, casting lots, trying to decide what day they're supposed to kill the Jews, all of them in the entire country. What I'm going to posit to you is that this is actually the most direct influence you see from God in the story. That God is the one who ultimately chooses the day. And here's my reason for that. Did you notice on which day the king's scribes gathered together to write this edict? It says in chapter 3, verse 12. Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month. The 13th day of the first month. And they write this command that all of the Jews are supposed to die. Do you know what happened on the 14th day of the first month? Passover. The exact day after the exact day after this edict is written, in which all of the Jews are commanded to die, the Jews are supposed to celebrate the fact that God saves. We're supposed to see the writing of this edict in connection with the Passover. But it's a lingering question. The lingering question is, the people have now been expelled from the land. They've been cast into captivity. They're not even in Israel. Esther's the queen of Persia, and Persia is reigning. Is God's covenant still active? Is God still going to save them? That would be a major question for them. But I want to show you. So I believe that this is God still controlling everything, and he will bring it to the greatest good. But I do have one more question for you. So even this scene is one of injustice, because the whole nation would suffer for one man's actions. And the destruction of the people of God would nullify the promises made to Abraham and the promises made to David. Why would God allow such injustice? And the reason why I ask that is because there is still injustice today that happens on a personal level and on a national level. There are still people who suffer wrongly. Christians are not always treated fairly. Why? We still need this question. So let me answer that question on two fronts. The first is concerning Mordecai. God allowed him in chapter 3 to be overlooked, to not be honored at the time in which he could have been, should have been. And he left Mordecai alone. But because he did so, Mordecai is going to be in the exact position that God is going to need him later on. Not honored, and still needing to be. And God is going to use that to his own advantage. But this can also be true. So God has ultimate good in mind for why he doesn't honor Mordecai at this time. But the same can be true of our lives. We may feel that we have been unfairly overlooked or neglected for an honor or promotion or celebration. But God can have purpose in our position no matter what. Here's our job. Our job is to grow where we're planted. God has a purpose for us being where we are in our life. And all we can do is try to multiply and produce for God wherever we are. And that he might have the greatest glory for that. But then concerning Haman's plot, this second injustice, God doesn't remove free will, even if that free will is evil plots and plans. That's why there's always going to be suffering in the world, is because sometimes we suffer simply because of the decisions that someone else is making. But God can have a purpose even in our difficult circumstances. So think about the great things that happen when things aren't going easy in your life. One, you can learn to trust God. When you're not relying simply on your own power all the time, you can grow to rely on his, and that is a healthy thing for every human heart. But the second thing that benefits when we go through bad times, and even when there's great injustice in the world, is that God can be honored when he's the one doing the saving. So just because it seems like evil is winning doesn't mean God is doing nothing. Even when God is unseen, he can act powerfully. Even when there is injustice, God still has providence. That's what I wanted to share with you from our text tonight. We have one more song to sing tonight, and it's I Need Thee Every Hour. We are relying on God. We are relying on God in good times and in bad. We're relying on God every moment of the day. But this song is not just about needing God. It's about needing God and him to save. Do you need him now? Do you need him to intervene in your life in some way? whether it's to forgive sin or to begin a new life in Him. Whatever that need may be, come to the front row and let your need be known. We'll always sing, we'll always sing.
I need thee every hour, most gracious Lord. No tender voice like thine can peace afford. I need thee, oh, I need thee. Every hour I need thee. Oh, bless me now, my Savior. I come to thee. I need thee every hour. Stay thou near by. Temptations lose their power when thou art nigh. I need thee, oh, I need thee. Every hour I need thee. Oh, bless me now, my Savior. I come to thee. I need thee every hour. Enjoy your day. Come quickly and abide, or life is vain. I need thee, oh, I need thee. Every hour I need thee. Oh, bless me now, my Savior. I come to thee. I need thee every hour, most holy one. Oh, make me thine indeed, thou blessed Son. I need thee, oh, I need thee. Every hour I need thee. Oh, bless me now, my Savior. I come to thee.
So, Noah has come forward this evening, not confessing his sins. Actually, he spent most of it pointing out to Mr. Steve, so I don't know what's going on with that.
Get down!
You want to get down? Hey. Thanks for being here tonight. Thanks for coming to worship together. Is there anyone who needs to partake of the Lord's Supper? Hey, go see Mom. Go see Mom. Anyone who needs to partake of the Lord's Supper, there's a couple. The Lord's Supper will be served in room B after the service is over. And other than that, if there's no other announcements, right now we'll be led in our closing prayer.
Our Father of heaven, we come to you today praising you and thanking you so much for your Son, Jesus, who died for us. You bless us so much. It's beyond belief. Each time that we fail to give you the praise, we fail to do the thing we want to do. Father, we pray for this church and things that it stands for, and the leaders of the church, the elders and the deacons, Josh and his family. Father, we pray for the sick. Each and every one has been mentioned. May your healing hand be with them, help them in any way to recover and become part of this group again. Father, we're so thankful again for your Son, Jesus. Father, we know our worst enemy is sin. It stands between us and you all the time. As we go out into this world this next week, be with us, help us, guide us, keep us from sin, keep us in your heart so that we can come back and assemble again here as Christians, set in your word, things from the things that apply to our lives, the things that we need to do to grow our faith in the borders of your kingdom. Our Father, we ask now that you go with us as we go to our respective places. Lead us and guide us. Bring us back to the next point in time.